Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this Google Hangout on the future of campaign finance. I am Fuzz Hogan, the managing editor here at New America. We're joined today by Mark Schmitt, in the pink shirt, who is the director of the program on political reform here at New America. Mark's also sitting in front of the ends of a tornado. Is that correct, Mark? Is there a...
I didn't see an actual tornado.
Sideways rain.
But I mean, I was hoping for Land of Oz and all that, but it doesn't seem to have happened.
Katherine Mangu-Ward, managing editor of Reason Magazine. Hello, Katherine.
Hey there.
You seem to be farther away from windows after the tornado came by.
Yeah, because I was told to shelter in place. So.
Shelter in place. All right, cool. I did not hide under my desk. For everyone watching on YouTube,
a libertarian who does what she's told is a little.
Whoa!
Yeah, you know what? You know who told me to? I think the government texted me. I got.
I got that.
Oh, we all got texts. I couldn't tell if it was my weather app or whether it was like some.
No, I'm pretty sure it was the government.
Government. All right, cool. Score one. For everyone watching on YouTube, from the government or otherwise, encourage you to ask questions to these folks by tweeting at New America or by using the hashtag elections-hangouts. That's a long hashtag. Or elections hangout. All right, cool. Thanks. I got Justin here to help me out. Mark, starting with you, because you are the director of the political reform program. Let's set the table here. What are the big decisions that the Supreme Court has made or lower courts have made? Where are we with current law? And what is the state of play in campaign finance?
Sure. Well, I think I always make the argument that the Supreme Court decisions that we've heard a lot about, which begin with the Citizens United decision in 2009, the McCutcheon decision this year, they've almost had more of a cultural effect than a specific legal effect. Like they've created Citizens United said that corporations could independently, spend to influence elections. The McCutcheon decision lifted the limits on the total amount that a person could contribute to all candidates and parties put together. So now somebody, if they wanted to contribute to every Republican and every Republican committee or every Democratic committee, you could contribute up to about $3.5 million. But not too many people are doing that. Not too many corporations are that, particularly publicly traded corporations, are that engaged in the political process, but it all created a sense of anything goes. And Citizens United led to a decision called Speech Now, which is a circuit court decision, but that led to the creation of super PACs, which have become pretty significant. And then there was the realization, not so much of a legal decision, but of a realization that you could take a particular kind of nonprofit, which is called a 501c4, which is a type of nonprofit that your donations to it aren't tax exempt, but that kind of nonprofit can do lobbying and some electoral activity. You could use a committee like that really as the equivalent of a campaign committee. And they can't coordinate with campaigns, but at this point, they're amounting in some states to more than the money that's being spent by the campaigns themselves and the committee. Sometimes that's called dark money because the donors aren't disclosed. That's obviously a little bit of a pejorative term. But in a way we're seeing, I think this might be the last election where the regulated system where contributions are limited to basically to $5,200 a person for the primary and general election together, and sources are disclosed. This might be the last election where that really is the biggest force compared to these outside committees. And I think a lot of that is legal, but a lot of it is just a cultural response to the sense of, okay, anything goes now, and we got to keep up with the other people who are doing this.
So, Katherine, Supreme Court is culture trendsetters more than legal prognosticators. Is that the right way to view that?
I mean, it is in a sense, but what I hear Mark saying is basically people on the left really lost their minds over Citizens United. There was like a pretty major national freak out about that. You probably remember during the State of the Union, Obama referencing it, and the Supreme Court justices shaking their heads. And I mean, there's a lot of sort of feelings running high about that decision. But what Mark is saying is right, which is that actually that decision didn't change that much legally. His take on the culture, I think, is a little more controversial. I would say, things are a little bit more transparent when we talk about sort of structures that are letting people spend outside of traditional election spending, but that people were always doing that. That this was, campaign dollars are like water; they just flow around obstacles. And while it's true that the Citizens United decision removed one obstacle, You know, it was a rock in a stream. It was never going to be a sort of massive shift in the legal landscape, despite the sort of initial public reaction. So I would say, yes, it's true that, you know, we are once again sort of rethinking the way we, as a society, sort of are okay with money flowing, but it's always going to flow, and it always has.
So it's a recognition of reality. A reminder, by the way, to ask your questions by hashtag elections hangout. Questions are coming in, but I'll get to those in just a second. So it's as much about the recognizing, Katherine, reality of campaign finance. Is that the way you're saying, more than actually issuing a ruling?
That's true, but I think it's a little bit more than that. It's also that, you know, existing, you know, the campaign finance restrictions as they existed before Citizens United, as they were understood, I think genuinely were unconstitutional, and I think the ones that remain do continue to be, particularly if you take the view, which many people do, that campaign donations are a form of speech, that basically the whole point of protections of speech, or one of the sort of central points, is to protect political speech, that this is the kind of speech that was being squelched, that people were reacting to in the founding era, and to say, oh no, just kidding. Actually, you can say almost anything, anytime, except when you say specific things about candidates in a specific window before the election, and then that's not allowed. Or if you say it by paying for airtime to say it, then it's not allowed. I think that's a sort of fundamental misunderstanding of you know, what free speech should look like, and frankly, I'm glad every time one of these things gets peeled back or worked around.
Great. Mark, one last question before we go to the hashtag elections hangout questions. Was campaign finance, were the laws around that sort of like a latticework dam, like it wasn't working, so you might as well pull the dam down? I mean, before Citizens United, was the situation actually better?
Well, I think there were different eras of political reform, of campaign finance. So, you know, in the 1990s, you had the soft money era where most money was running through parties. And then after the McCain-Feingold law, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, which created the obstacle, which created the rule that was kind of undone by the Citizens United ruling, you had the beginnings of money moving more through outside groups. Originally, the 529 groups that were reported to the IRS, so there was some disclosure there, and then gradually it moved to these other groups. I think I don't say it's a ladder. I want to come back to Katherine's point and just respond to it really quickly, and then go back a little bit. I mean, there is a concept sometimes called electoral exceptionalism. Like, elections are rule-based activity. We have certain rules for elections that promote a certain kind of level of fairness. You know, the classic one would be that, you know, you can't do electioneering within 75 feet of a voting booth, and that's something most people accept. It's definitely a restriction on free speech. You can't you can't yell at a person while they're in the voting booth, things like that. Those are absolutely, that's the beginning of a restriction on free speech. It is a restriction on speech, but that makes the boundaries of the election possible and reasonable. And we do the same around money in elections, and that's the reason why you have that boundary about spending and contributions in the election that you don't have in other zones of political speech. So in a way, it's not like just silly that we restrict election speech and not other political speech. It's kind of fundamental to making elections work. But I accept that it is. I don't say things like money isn't speech, because restricting the money that people can use to be heard is a restriction. It can be a restriction on speech, but there's a zone in which we structure that a little bit. And then, you know, is it a lattice work of that's going to fall apart? I think one thing that really matters a lot is it's not just like water that's going to flow no matter what. Money gets raised. You know, if people weren't out there raising and collecting money, and either politicians or brokers weren't involved with it, you know, not too many people. I've never made a spontaneous political contribution that somebody didn't ask me for, and that's pretty generally true. So in a way, what really matters is who has the power, right? So in an older era, in the soft money era of the 90s, the parties had power. Some people think that's actually better, that it's disciplining on the system, as opposed to outside groups that are unaccountable and might be there for one election and never appear again. But really, it's not just like this natural thing. What we should think about these laws is a matter of like who is empowered by the structure we have. And right now, we're kind of empowering the people who are brokers of the big political committees, the 501c4s and the American Crossroads and their Democratic counterparts and so forth.
Cool. Thanks again. Reminding you, promoting hashtag. I keep saying promoting because to me. Sorry. Hashtag elections hangout at New America. Katherine, you got to come get your New America cups, bud. You got to come down to the office and get them.
I work here, and I haven't gotten a cup.
I have a much better cup. Check out my awesome one.
Oh, nice. That's good. Here's the first question, and that goes to Mark's point about who's giving money and why. So Leona Hampson, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. Are we concerned about charter school operators and Wall Street backers and whether their big contributions could enableize privatizing public education? There's a lot packed in there. I'm going to start with Mark, but I'm certain that Katherine has some thoughts on that.
I mean, that's a fascinating question. In a way, it goes to the point I just raised about elections. Like, there's a lot of there's a lot of ways in which concentrated wealth affects public policy, right? And it's not just elections. So over the past 10, 15 years, a lot of wealthy people, ranging from Bill Gates at the Gates Foundation, the Walton Foundation, a lot of hedge fund people have been really interested in the idea of charter schools, whether their motive is to privatize public education or experiment with some different models. I'm not going to be judgmental about that, but they've basically introduced a public policy innovation in a big way because they had money. They were either funding charter schools directly, or they were funding advocacy around charter schools. They were funding organizations like Michelle Rhee's Students First. It is, I think, a really interesting challenge to democracy. There's no universe in which you can restrict that. It's not, campaign spending is a relatively small part of what that money does as a whole. And I think if in the end we move to a world where we have nothing but charter schools and the traditional public school system is gone, which I'm not going to express an opinion about that idea. I think if that happens, the story won't be they made a lot of campaign contributions. The story will be they created this idea, they experimented with it, they created lots of options, and they campaigned for it. There's a little bit of campaign money involved. Organizations like Democrats for Education Reform, for example, it's one of the few issues you have now that's actually got support that's bipartisan. Which whenever you have something that's got some bipartisan edge, you can actually kind of maneuver more effectively in the system than something that just falls onto one side or the other of the gridlock. So I think that's been part of the reason for their success. But it's a real reminder that concentrated wealth and the inequality of wealth works in really complicated ways in our policy process.
Yeah, I mean, I would just jump in and say that I think embedded in that question is this sort of idea that certain causes or a certain sort of ideological set of causes are more likely to have money behind them. And I think what Mark said is right, which is that actually education reform is increasingly something that it is bipartisan, that people are funding it for lots of different reasons, and I am sure it's true that somewhere someone is giving money to support efforts to promote charter schools because they themselves hope to run a charter school management company, but mostly that's not why people give money. Mostly they're giving it for lots of reasons, including sort of the purist, just warm fuzzy, like they want poor kids to have a good chance at a good education type reasons, and also sort of something in between, which might be that they want their own children to have a good chance or a better chance for an education that fits their learning style or something like that. The idea that somehow like Wall Street and charter management organizations will be able to take over the political process, and that the political process would be heavily tilted toward a set of causes which you would associate with Republicans or something like that, simply isn't true. The other thing Citizens United did, for instance, was really free up unions to just go completely nuts with their political spending too. There's been a lot of back and forth about how many, is it okay if it's like $1 union is spent for every dollar that's spent by some character that could be in a Michael Lewis novel, but or a Michael Lewis book. But I think there is this weird belief that like rich people are conservative or Republican, and that their money will go disproportionately to those causes. It's just not true for the most part. So Mark is right that a lot, people with a lot of money have a bigger megaphone, but the idea that results in a certain set of political views being ascendant, I think, is far from proven.
Well, can I drive a minute to just
totally.
I want
to zoom out a little bit too. I want to zoom out about just basically. I think you touched on it a couple of minutes ago too, Mark. Is the notion of separating elections from the broader notion of people who want to influence public thought, right? Whether they're left or right, and being able to influence public thought with money.
Sure. Well, and
that is ever thus, right?
And on that point, I mean, there is, with elections, it's sort of a zero-sum game. But for the most part, the general public discussion about, well, are charter schools a good thing? It's not zero-sum. You have to sort of get out there and convince people. But there could be a proliferation of views. There could be many shades of gray. There could be lots of different levels of discussion and policy making. So again, it is important to make that distinction. Somebody's going to win an election, but like, not to be cheeseball, but like we can all win a productive public discourse.
Well, let me just disagree with Katherine on 2 points there. I mean, one, unions and corporations aren't completely equivalent entities. Unions are collectives of people organized for particular collective action. They also have rules that require them to do a level of disclosure that corporations aren't required to do. So I don't want to fully fall into that. I also want to say on the particular point about charter schools, let's say, politicians, one factor you have is the politicians spend a lot of time with certain kinds of people who are donors. They may spend a lot of time with, for example, hedge fund folks, and those folks tend to be really enthusiastic about charter schools, for better or for worse. They're less likely, for example, to spend time with, say, people in a community who've organized something really innovative in education that isn't necessarily a charter school, but that makes their school work better. Politicians may not even be aware of something like that because those aren't the people they're spending time with in the current system. And so time has as much of an effect as the specific dollar for result.
That's true, but I will just throw in here that the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers consistently are some of the biggest, sometimes in some years, the biggest donors to campaigns. So again, there's a difference between sort of soft money and hard money, but the idea that somehow politicians are hobnobbing with hedge funders and not hearing the voices of teachers, right. They're hobnobbing with the head of the NEA too.
That is true.
So a question from @Ben. A guy named Ben just has he's the first guy named Ben to be on Twitter. Way to go, Ben. Is it possible?
I couldn't even get M. Schmitt in 2007.
I'm always good with Buzz Hogan. I never had problems getting into Buzz Hogan, but geez, Ben. Man, I want to be Ben. Is it possible to enforce a regulation or idea purchasing a certain amount of money in broadcast media is no longer free speech? In other words, and this goes to another question about what is speech. And it also goes to a question I want to make sure I ask that I'm sure is about transparency and whether you thrust yourself in the public opinion, the vortex of public opinion by how much money you give, right? I'm sure it's something Katherine's going to have a question about too. But like, I think what he's asking is, if you bought this much money in broadcast media, is that still free speech?
I mean, I think the answer is yes. I mean, there's this tricky problem with broadcast media, which is that we have this sort of historic notion that it's its own category, that it's a public good. This is what gives rise to stuff like the fairness doctrine, which is the idea
the long gone fairness doctrine.
The long gone fairness, but this is and occasionally revived, seriously or not, this idea that because the airwaves are a public good, that they need to give equal time or fair time to competing views. I think we do have this sort of notion of the airwaves as a special category. I think that increasingly is irrelevant because people do consume their political speech in so many different ways. In newspapers, online, on cable, streaming. I mean, the sort of special place that broadcast television once occupied is no longer nearly as exalted. But I mean, I think, already we are basically saying, listen, we trust corporations to make decisions about how much political speech to air on the networks themselves, right? Like, the idea that somehow, like, we can totally trust CBS, but, like, we can't trust, like, George Soros to purchase lots of time on CBS. I don't think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of my allies who favor reform will often use the phrase, we don't want free speech to drown out other people's free speech. And that word drown out is a complicated word. But a classic example of it would be in a sort of older model where you have 3 networks, maybe in some town you only get 2 of them, and somebody who has, a candidate who has millions of dollars can essentially buy so much time that voters aren't able to see any of the other candidates' ads, and that's in response to things like that. There used to be kind of a movement for free television time for all candidates. That was something I thought was a very, very intriguing idea when I first got involved in this issue. We are in fact past that, and
yeah, the UK used to have a ban on television, but now it's
a ban on television. You could. I mean, the only ways in which we could legally require the free time, of course, are with broadcasters who have broadcast licenses. So you can't really require it. The FCC couldn't require it for cable stations. There could be some agreement to do it. But the point is, I mean, Catherine's right. There are a lot of other channels now, and you're beginning to see the possibility. Somebody just sent me a story about the mayor of Providence, which is a medium-sized, decent-sized city, and typically people running for mayor of Providence would run a lot of TV ads. The new mayor of Providence didn't run any TV ads, and he spent less, and he won because he spent his money on some of it on online, where you can do a lot more targeting of people you actually want to reach, and more on on the ground mobilizing, and I think there's more of a premium. I think there's gradually more of a premium on those 2 factors, particularly the door-to-door mobilizing of your allies, as opposed to that model we have of like blasting these 30-second ads at people who are going to vote, but they don't know who they're going to vote for, and they're kind of sitting like zombies as stuff gets blasted at them during the breaks on Jeopardy. That's just a smaller and smaller fraction of the world that's just sitting there waiting for that 30-second ad to tell them what to do.
Let us hope there are fewer political ads, boy.
What's that?
Let us hope there's fewer political ads on television. That gets annoying every fall.
Well, there are more political emails, so it's a trade-off.
And I've been corrected, Justin. His Twitter handle is Ben Hemp, @Ben Hemp. So sorry, Ben. I didn't mean to make you seem so original as you. So
if he got hemp, that would be good too.
Yeah,
the guy who really has @Ben is like, what's going on?
Diane Semorowski, again, apologies for mispronouncing. How much is dark money? I don't know if that's a term of art, y'all, but I heard this is the question. How much is dark money affecting elections in these midterms?
Considerably. I mean, dark money is it's a controversial term of art. You can use it for basically any kind of organization that's not disclosing its donors, which are typically the 501c4s, that like American Crossroads. I saw the numbers yesterday. I just wrote them into an article, and I never remember numbers, so I don't remember the exact amount. There's a report at opensecrets.org, which is the Center for Responsive Politics. They have an estimate, and they show what it will be if it continues at the same pace. That's really all we know about that is kind of what we see from ad buys. Again, so it's mostly looking at television advertising. You don't know what these groups are doing, but you can, if you're really smart about it, see the ad buys. They're not reporting things to the Federal Elections Commission. Cool. So
yeah, I mean, I would just chime in and say, like, that question is reasonable given our previous discussion, but it also misses the point, which is that, like, dark money has always influenced every election, always, right? That, whether or not you want to say, okay, well, we now have kind of a specifically defined category of, 501c4s and 527s and whatever, that is a number you could probably get or sort of get close to, but still the idea that, particularly in midterms where we're looking more at the state level, there's this idea that somehow there's a new guy in town, a new force with the dark money, and that is making elections different than they used to be. I think that's not right.
Catherine, I don't think that's correct, because we never had such a wide window of totally undisclosed money before. There was a period when
we just didn't know because it wasn't disclosed, right?
Yeah, I mean, how do we know?
No, because it's got to move through some. It's got to move through some legal vehicle or another. I mean, in the pre-1974 era, the money that Richard Nixon got, yeah, that was undisclosed and we didn't know anything.
I mean, it's true that elections used to be cheaper, right? It is true that there was just like less money total.
There was less money, yeah.
But that's the idea that sort of one side or the other. I mean, what that question is asking is like, who has the advantage, or is it changing the issue profile that people care about, or is the thing that's happening in the run-up to an election different in kind than it used to be? And I'm not sure that that's true.
And so balance to me, just let me take a second off the Twitter questions on this to drill down here a bit. Balance transparency and privacy here. Like, as a journalist, we're all journalists, right? It seems to me you solve all problems with sunshine.
Right. And there's this sort of, anyone who's ever used Open Secrets, you immediately are like, oh my God, I know all the things, right? Like, as a journalist, the idea that there are these giant databases, not only of who's giving money, like corporations or big, big nonprofits or unions, but also, individuals, right? There are these gigantic databases of every individual contribution to a candidate. I will say, I think, in the same vein of thinking of political giving in its many forms as political speech, I think we should have a right to anonymous speech. That's something that we see as very important online. That privacy advocates make a big deal of. That anonymity is sometimes an incredibly important element in getting whistles blown, in getting information out there that otherwise wouldn't get out. What we saw with Prop 8 in California, where a bunch of Mormon donors got targeted for having given to the sort of unpopular cause of repealing gay marriage, I think that's actually troublesome. I mean, all things being equal, you get out there, you say what you believe, you give your money, you stand behind it, but there are lots of good reasons to want anonymity.
Well, that goes to my question. Is there a certain amount of money that you give that you therefore do, to use a journalism term, thrust yourself into the vortex of public opinion? Should we therefore be able to know simply by a certain amount of dollars that you contributed would warrant your name having to be public?
Maybe, but I think that number should be a lot higher than like $100 or $200, which is what it is now.
Well, I think you can read the Wall Street Journal every day, and Kimberly Strassler has an article just about every day of like the latest outrage of disclosure, and it's pretty exaggerated. I am actually sympathetic to the idea that the $200 disclosure limit is a little too low. If you change other things, I mean, the fact that like sometimes if you Google somebody, the first thing you might see is their political contribution. You're not really learning anything about the political process there. You're just learning something about a person that you wouldn't actually know otherwise. But overall, I think if we're going to have a system where people and corporations are able to spend let's say $3.5 million just in the hard money space alone, we do have a right to know what that money is doing and where people are getting their support. When people give to a candidate, it's not actually their own speech. They're enabling somebody else's speech. They're enabling somebody else to hold political power through their speech. And we do need to know, let's take the classic case where somebody has kind of a single bankroller, like Sheldon Adelson backing, Newt Gingrich in 2012. When somebody has a single bankroller or two bankrollers or, a small number of people who, without them, they would not be in a position to run for office or hold political power, and we're giving that person a lot of political power, we are entitled to know who at the very least, we should know who their obligation is to, who put them in that position where they're able to exercise political power in that way. It's complicated, I think, for voters to make to use that disclosure and make those choices. I don't hold the view that disclosure solves all problems, and I think after Citizens United, which in theory at least left the window open to disclosure, a lot of people said, well, let's just do everything we can with disclosure. Disclosure is the solution. We'll do all we can with that. I don't accept that. I think disclosure does a certain number of things well. I think it's important above a certain level, and I think it's important to have the same playing field for disclosure, no matter what form the contribution takes. But I think you need to do other things in addition to disclosure to actually create the kind of electoral space that's reasonably balanced.
Cool.
Also, though, it's important to keep in mind, right, that it's not a cost-free thing. I think people often behave as if disclosure is something that's like, well, we should do it, and like maybe it won't solve all the problems, but like, what's the downside? And you can talk smack about Kim Strausel if you want, but like that's the downside. Every day, every single day, she does have a story about the downsides of disclosure. That people who sincerely want to participate in the political process with money are discouraged from doing so, or wind up having that participation distorted by these disclosure requirements.
Right.
And I think when corporations give, when unions give, there are already other mechanisms in place that make it hard for collections of individuals, which, by the way, I think corporations are too, but it makes it hard for collections of individuals to really do that completely secretly. You're right that one rich dude who wants to give all the money in the world to a dude who wants to have power, that would be structurally quite easy to keep secret in the absence of disclosure requirements. But almost anything else, the truth will out.
Well, cool. Somewhere between that and where I am, we can find a reasonable.
Much closer to my way.
Okay. Two more questions left in Whaler hockey. Sorry, little youth reference of mine. New America Senior Fellow Lee Drutman, we know him. What is a positive vision of how elections should work? Probably should have been the last question, I realized. And let's go live in a sunny, happy place. And how does all the outside money alter that vision? Mark.
Well, my vision, and I think this is really important, and Lee just joined New America and has been working with me, so that maybe this is a little bit of a...
This is a plant!
It's not a plant. It's not a plant. He said he would ask some questions, and I didn't tell him what questions to ask. But I think what you want to look for is a system that creates a lot of opportunity, both for people to run for office and be heard, and have a chance to participate in that level, and for citizens to participate in a meaningful way, not just as voters or maybe as volunteers, but as small donors in a way that their small donation has some value. So I look at things like, for example, the New York City campaign finance system, which provides a 6-to-1 match on small donations. That encourages, for example, politicians to go out and reach out to people who aren't hedge fund managers, and hear from them, or even like the Arizona system where you have like a small contribution that enables you to get full public financing. Kind of changes the picture for citizens and also makes it a lot easier to run for to run for office. So in New York City, the majority of city council races have pretty robust contests. So there's a lot of participation at every level. So I look at it I think corruption is a real legitimate concern. That's the kind of thing we just talked about when you think of somebody being bankrolled by an individual. I think, some measure of political equality is valuable, but that's not something the court has ever wanted to accept as a way of structuring campaign reform, but really kind of the idea of political opportunity. More opportunity. Are people able to run? Are the barriers to entry low enough that people can get in the game? That doesn't mean they win and be heard. But I think part of that, there's a real value to coupling both rules governing campaign finance reform, which I would put a big emphasis on small donor matching programs like New York's. But we also ought to be creative about structures that make it possible, that help you get a little bit beyond the limits of winner-take-all politics. So things like ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting, things like fusion, which really only also exists in New York with the Working Families Party and the Conservative Party there, that gives some openness to other voices in the system rather than just one Democrat, one Republican battle it out, or just a winner-take-all primary. So, I just saw in Minneapolis they had a mayoral election using ranked choice voting, where you basically pick your first choice, second choice, third choice, and there's a lot of value in appealing. If you're a candidate, you want to make sure you're getting the second choice votes of somebody who supports one of the other candidates. They had 35 candidates in Minnesota, but in the end, the new mayor who was a community activist, not the best funded candidate by far, had 49% of the vote. So there's a broad consensus of support. I think systems like that are going to be important to making the ideal electoral system, not just focus on money in politics.
I think if you're worried about money in politics, it's worthwhile to think about why all that money is pouring into politics in the first place. And to me, the answer is pretty clear, which is that there's a lot to win. There's a lot to win because government is huge and has huge amounts of money at its disposal and has many, many programs that directly benefit corporations or individuals or unions in particular narrow ways to the general expense of the taxpayer. So, the idea that the problem is the money flowing into politics and that if it weren't for all this money flowing in, then maybe our elections would be more honest or more open or more truly reflective views of the electorate, I think kind of misses the mark. Rather than try to kind of choke the money flowing into politics, I would say let's limit the payoff that people who dump that money in can get. And so that means, on the smallest scale, an issue that's current right now, the Ex-Im Bank, right? There's this massive thing that is money flowing out of Washington, which is basically a subsidy for Boeing. It gives money to foreign governments or foreign companies to purchase U.S. goods. That's super high stakes, and that's a great way to be like, hey, Boeing, you want to dump a ton of money into the U.S. political process and like goof it up in various ways? Get rid of that. That's like a narrow prescription. I think more broadly, the less cash that politicians have to throw around, the less likely people are to throw cash at politicians. So if that freaks you out, and it's reasonable that it might, one way to approach it is to just say, well, why are people throwing that money in the first place, and take away those negative incentives, take away the power that politicians have.
You touched on something. It's almost, and it's not the last question, but it raises the question of when we complain about money in politics, are we complaining because we can't appreciate that someone else might think differently to us, so we assume the other side is just being paid to think that way?
A little bit. I mean, there's lots of evidence that money follows ideology rather than vice versa, right? That people give to politicians who already agree with them. They're not taking a politician who disagrees with them and buying their vote in kind of a narrow way on some particular issue. So, I think, from that perspective, yeah, what we want to say is like, that politician did something I didn't like. Let me try and figure out why. Oh, look, he was bribed.
Right.
Which is easier for people to understand in sort of a deep level than to say, could disagree about this issue, and he's voting differently than I am. Right. But again, at the same time, it's like it matters less if your guy disagrees with you on, if your representative disagrees with you on an issue, if he doesn't have the power to essentially like write $1 billion check to Boeing about it.
Right.
So, sorry, Mark.
No, I mean, I think Katherine makes some good points. I think there's a mix of, politicians being affected by money and politicians simply following the path they believe, which seem to follow on some pretty narrow tracks at the moment. And we ought to respect both of those. And it's true. It's always very hard to say here's the decision. There are always people who want to do that, to say here's the right thing to do. Here's what the politicians did. Here's the cost. That's essentially the cost of money in politics. Very tempting to do that. Very, very hard to do because you've got a normative decision about what the right thing is to do. Like I think I kind of think we have a tax preference for capital gains income because of the influence of wealthy donors. Well, somebody else, probably Katherine, thinks we have a tax preference for capital gains because it's an economically sound thing to do. I'm not going to convince her. She's probably not going to convince me. And unless we agreed on that, we're not going to agree that this is the role of money in politics. So that's always going to be a challenge.
It reminds me of the study a couple years ago in media. People complain that media is biased, right? But actually, they tracked news organizations by their audience, their editors, and some other population. And the news media's usage of language mostly tracked their audience, not even their editors or their funders or their owners, which meant they're just selling a product and they're trying to reach an audience, and so whatever bias you see in a news organization, in a piece of media, is just selling the product to the right audience.
You're just looking in the mirror.
Yeah, exactly. So two more questions. I realized I said two earlier, but I do have a really good one I want to get to. And it's about us, folks. I recognize that we are three white people. And so it's a question of who's talking about this topic. And so the question there from Spirit Equality is, do the current campaign finance laws inhibit diversity? Is there an impact?
Well, that was my question.
So Justin added on to the good question. Right. They were commenting on the whiteness of our panel, so we're going to go in and say, is there a diversity problem as a consequence of campaign finance?
Well, sure. I mean, wealth is even more racially concentrated than income. So the ability to, to donate is pretty limited among. I mean, there's a growing black middle class, so there's some giving there, but it is pretty concentrated. It's interesting. One of the issues that's always come up is that there's very often a concern. African American and Latino activists will say the biggest thing hurting us is not money in politics. It's the way districts are drawn, or it's voting rights, it's voter ID laws that affect us disproportionately. It's access to the polls and things like that. So there's often among people. I mean, we're coming at a campaign finance from different viewpoints, but often those who favor campaign finance reform have also often been a very white group, because we're not as concerned with voter ID laws, for example, that don't affect white people as much. So it's an interesting, complicated thing. It's in the last year or so, I think there's been a real transformation of that, with much more engagement by organizations like NAACP in a whole in basically a coalition around a whole range of democracy issues that do include the role of money in politics, because they're beginning to see that as not a separate issue over here, but integrally related to a lot of the other concerns about access to the political process, and to use a phrase I used before, political opportunity. Folks are beginning to see those as related.
Katherine, anything there before one last question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just briefly add that, I think there is not a particular kind of racial overlay on this discussion, like the idea that corporations in particular, which people worry about, are giving more money, although not that much more money, but are giving more money to politicians. This is happening at a time when slowly, the C-level executives, the boardrooms of corporations are becoming more diverse. They're not there yet, but again, if your concern is like big organizations have power, which again is different than rich individuals, but if your concern is that big organizations have power, it is true that right now those organizations are not racially represented. The people making decisions about that kind of spending are not racially representative, but I think the problem there isn't campaign finance laws. The problem there is sort of the broad social issue of racism. This is not something that's specific to how money flows into politics.
Now we have one last question. It's from Ken Handler on Twitter, who asks, why not consider changing the House term to 4 years if we can't change money in politics? Should we consider changing the way elections are run? So, and I'll make this more of a last question. Either that one, or name one thing, the one thing each of you would change to make elections better.
I mean, for the first part of the question, this sort of, is there something that we could do that would, well, I guess the second part of the question, the one thing, I mean, I guess I would just come back to my previous answer, which is take some of the sort of, just take the low-hanging fruit, like Ex-Im Bank, like specific pork barrel type projects, like, just take those powers out of the hands of politicians. Truly just build a library on this plot of land means this company will directly benefit, and so that company will give money. Just get rid of that stuff. Earmarks and some sort of straightforward subsidies. Agricultural subsidies are another place to look. It won't fix everything, but I think people who are worried about money in politics would be pleasantly surprised to find people backing off certain kinds of the most insidious kinds of giving disappearing in light of those direct benefits disappearing.
Katherine, I didn't respond to that. I want to back up on that. How would you make those administrative decisions? I mean, the alternative to earmarks, right, is the agency makes the decision about funding. I guess the alternative to Ex-Im Bank is there is no Ex-Im Bank. But when you say take it away from politicians, are you assuming that you then give more
I mean, what I'm saying is take it out of the hands of government. I mean, I'm saying
don't do them.
Don't do it at all, right? If we're looking at price supports for corn,
Right.
the option, the alternative isn't like let's give it to some sort of technocrat who will make pure decisions about the right price of corn. I'm saying let the market decide the price.
Right. Now, and the other response to that, I will answer the actual question, Fuzz. But I mean, some of us see the causal chain a little bit differently. Like, why do we have price supports for corn? Obviously, it's an industry that has a lot of power. That power comes in part from the money that it provides. It comes in part from.
You're drawing a circle here. We're subsidizing to get corn sales, and we're subsidizing. Yeah, exactly.
But I mean, there are definitely things where senators from state X are not going to not support an industry even if it never gives them a dime. I work for a senator from New Jersey. We did stuff for the pharmaceutical industry. That's the way it's going to be. Even though we were had no idea what the.
So that's why I'm saying if nobody has
create a baseline that doesn't allow any of that maneuvering.
It doesn't matter about the giving. It's just
Fuzz, I think that question is really interesting. I'm not sure I have a single silver bullet. It seems to me I've heard that 4-year terms for House members 3 times in the last week, and
the way to as I read that question, I realized I don't know that senators are spending. I think what he's motivated by is spending 4 hours a day raising money.
Well, that's right. There's the immediately you have to raise money, and you basically if you want to run for the House, you have to raise a massive amount of money, and then you have to keep doing it for your entire first 2 years, and probably do it again. Just which more.
But I think aren't senators spending much? I mean, senators who run for 6 years are still raising.
Right, they could probably go 3 years without. Once they have the base, they can go about 3 years without.
But this is also the same argument you hear for term limits all the time, right? It's the same deal, except for they're saying, well, let people raise money for their first term, but then let them be a purposeful lame duck, so they can just focus on governing. I think the folks who voluntarily term limited themselves as part of the Republican Revolution in the 90s, it's true they spent less time fundraising, but they also, once they were gone, and not much that they did, remained behind them. So
some of them are still around.
Some of them are still around. They managed to sort of letter the law out.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that this limiting or expanding the length of the House term will do much.
I think there's another logic to expanding the House term, though, which is that you have we've seen this situation over and over again, right, where you have an election and then you have a real sharp backlash in the other direction. And there's, is there any way you could get a little bit of continuity so that in the classic sense, party that's elected could kind of carry out some of its program? And if you only had half the House up for election, say after a president is elected, you wouldn't necessarily have quite as sharp a backlash. I think it's a little complicated by the simple fact that you'd have House members whose terms are up in presidential years and House members whose terms are up in non-presidential years, and the people who vote in those elections are totally different. So that would be a weird little idiosyncrasy of making the 4-year term. You could couple it with a 6-year presidential. I've actually always thought the 6-year single presidential term is a pretty interesting idea, which I think was something that was floated in 1978 and hasn't been heard from since. But
all right, cool. Well, thanks Mark, thanks Katherine, thanks to all of you for joining us for the hangout. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook at New America, and please be sure to read our e-magazine, The Weekly Wonk, at theweeklywonk.org. I'm sorry, just weeklywonk.org. And we will talk to you all at the next hangout. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, friends.